Hello, welcome to this week's Makeup and Monarchies episode. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany. I will be going over certain time frames in the UK's history, be it people or events or historical places. This week, we are talking about James I of Scotland in the years 15th century. So I hope you enjoy. All the products that I've used for this video are listed down below. If you like this, please give it a thumbs up. If you have not done so yet and this is up your alley, please hit the subscribe button. You can also find me on Instagram at Makeup and Monarchies. I hope you enjoy. Thanks. So we're starting today. We're talking about James I of Scotland. He was probably born in late July of 1394 in Dunfermline Abbey. He was the son of Robert III and grandson to Robert the Bruce and Annabella Drummond. 27 years after their marriage, they had James. Just going to cover the holy bejesus out of my face today because it's really bad. He would have spent most of his childhood in his mother's care until he was about 7 when his mother passed away. A year later, his older brother David was more than likely murdered by their uncle Robert Stewart at Falkland Castle, which was owned by Albany. I'm just saying this now. This one is going to get really, really confusing because the Duke of Albany title was passed down quite a few times in this time frame that I'm going to talk about. So it does, my eyes were crossing a few times, but I digress. So after his older brother was killed, this left James the heir to the throne, and in the way of the Albany Stuarts having the royal line transferred to them. This is a common occurrence that happens in this time frame. The Albany Stuarts were really after that throne, and it just goes the whole time. So in 1402, Robert Stewart and his ally Archibald, Earl of Douglas, were exonerated of any participation in David's death. This made a clear path for Albany to be reappointed as the king's lieutenant. I feel like I've been thrown for a loop today because I really had what I was going to do for my eyeshadow and my makeup today. But then UPS came with my order. If you watched my story on, Instagram, UPS came in early. I got my shipment early. I'm excited. So I'm changing it up a little bit today. So because of the support Douglas gave him, Albany allowed him to resume hostilities in England. So in September 1402, their large army was defeated by the English in Homildon. This led to a bunch of prominent nobles and their followers to be captured. This included Douglas, Albany's son Murdoch, and the Earls of Moray, Angus, and Orkney. That same year of Rothesay's death, Alexander Leslie, who was the Earl of Ross, and Malcolm Drummond, Lord of Mar, also died, leaving lesser men to fill those positions who weren't politically active prior to this happening. So between 1402 and 1406, The earldoms of Ross, Maury, and Mar were left without adult leaders, meaning the kids of the ones that had died were now would take over, but they were too young. So Murdoch Stuart was a prisoner in England, and Albany found himself having to form an alliance with his brother Alexander Stuart, Earl of Buchan. In December of 1404, King Robert granted the royal Stuart land in the west in Ayrshire and around the Firth of Clyde to James in regality. That protected them from outside interference and gave the prince a territorial center if he had needed one. The following year, little James was under... I'm trying to open something with one hand. So the following year, little James was under the protection of Bishop Wardlow of St. Andrews on the East Coast. Douglas was getting more angry as time went on and tensions were rising. So a decision was made to send the little prince to France and out of his uncle's reach. So the move was planned and happened in the winter of 1405 and 1406. And in February of 06, Fleming and Orkney were now in charge of the prince's journey. So I'm going to just go back. I think it was... So remember if you had watched episode 2 was on Robert the Bruce. Remember the alliance with France? That's still in effect. And remember I said it lasted a few hundred years. So we're still in that alliance at this point. So they... Like I said, Fleming and Orkney were now in charge of the little prince's journey. And James Douglas got wind of this and with his supporters killed Fleming while Orkney and James escaped. And they remained at Bass Rock Islet in the Firth of Forth for a month. Pull my chair in. They boarded a ship from Danzig on March 22nd. And the ship was seized by the English. So this led the 12-year-old James to being held captive by Henry IV of England. Robert III was at Rothesay Castle when he found out, and he died shortly after on April 4th. He was buried at the Stuart Foundation Abbey of Paisley. So while James was being held hostage, his uncle was being a sneaky bastard, and he was transitioning himself from lieutenant to governor. He took James's land so that he didn't have any income and he referred to him as the late king's son. So even though Robert III was now gone and James had the title that he was to inherit, Albany kind of like pushed his way through. Kind of like pushed his way through so he could become more than what he was, and obviously referred to James as the late king's son. That's really heavy. I'm just going to go back in with my transition shade and blend that out a little bit. So young King James had a small household that included Henry Sinclair, who was the Earl of Orkney, the nephew of Fleming, Alexander Seton, and Orkney's brother, John Sinclair. The household was paid for by the English. So these men went from high-ranking men to less noble, and James was given a good education by Henry, and James was also in the position to witness the king's ruling. So when he had personal visits from his household, as well as letters to particular people, he would be able to see how his country was doing. I think he did learn how to rule, or kind of took on Henry IV's style of ruling when he, down the line in the future for him. Henry IV died in 1413. So now Henry V immediately ended James's freedom by first holding him in the Tower of London with other Scottish prisoners. One of them was James's cousin Murdoch Stuart, who was Albany's son. He had been captured in 1402 at the Battle of Homildon. I'm going to butcher this. Homildon Hill. Remix. They were together in both the Tower and at Windsor until Murdoch's release in 1413. James's standing at court improved. He was no longer regarded as a hostage and now was a guest. Henry had brought James when he went to France. He used his presence against the Scots fighting for the French. Remember the alliance. Henry using it to his advantage. Side note here, if you've watched the movie The King on Netflix, that's this Henry. If you haven't seen it, it is really, really good. I thought it was phenomenal. Just as a movie, it was great. I liked that side of things, and I thought it was really well done, well filmed. It was great. So after the English won the siege of Melun, the Scots on the side of France were hanged for treason against their king. James had been in attendance for Catherine of Valois' coronation on February 23rd, 1421, and he sat at the Queen's left side during the banquet. Catherine of Valois was Henry V's wife. During Henry's tour of important towns in England, James was knighted on St. George's Day. Then, on July of 1421, Henry and James were campaigning in France to try and win the crown of France for Henry. Going back to the alliance, I'm going to go back to it again. I think here, James is just biding his time and trying to win favor in order to escape his hostage situation. I don't think for a minute he was on the English's side, but I think he was just playing the game that he needed to play until he could be released. So anyways, James was appointed along with the Duke of Bedford as joint commanders of the siege of Dreux on July 18th of 1421. On August 20th, they got the surrender from the garrison. Henry V died of dysentery on August 31st, 1422. In September, James was part of the escort to return the king's body back to England. With the infant king Henry VI on the throne, the council wanted to release James as soon as possible. This is Henry VI from the War of the Roses, episode 1 on War of the Roses. So we're kind of circling back to that. They attempted in early 1423 to got little response from Scotland, who were extremely influenced by the Albany Stuarts. The Earl of Douglas was an adaptable power in southern Scotland, and his influence shadowed the Albany Stuarts. I'm just going through and kind of blending out my crease shade here. Even though he was complacent in the killing of David, Douglas still engaged with James. Side note too on this, I cannot even fathom talking or discussing anything with somebody who killed my family member. It bewilders me, but again, I digress. So since 1421, Douglas was in regular contact with James. and they formed an alliance that was pivotal in 1423. So even though Douglas was to be the Scottish magnate, his positions were jeopardized. He would have to retake Edinburgh Castle from the warden he designated, and it was very likely at that time that this was under threat from both Earls Angus and March. So now Douglas, in return for James's endorsement of his position, was able to deliver his fondness of James's return to Scotland. So pressure from the advocates of the king compelled Murdoch, now Duke of Albany, after his father's death in 1420, to agree to a general council in August of 1423. It was then agreed that a mission be sent to England to negotiate James's release. Meanwhile, James's relationship with the House of Lancaster changed in 1424. He married Joan Beaufort, who was cousin to Henry VI and niece of Thomas Beaufort and Henry, Bishop of Winchester. So Joan and James would go on to have 8 children. So we have, I'm going to read their names off. We have Margaret Stuart, Isabella Stuart, Joan Stuart, Alexander Stuart, James II, Eleanor Stuart, Mary Stuart, and Annabella Stuart. So a ransom treaty was agreed in the amount of £40,000 at Durham on March 28th of 1424. King James and Queen Joan were escorted to Scotland by both English and Scottish nobles. They reached Melrose Abbey on the Scottish border, and they were met there by Albany, who gave up his governor's seal of office. I'm gonna go do my liner real quick, and my new one. I will be right back. Okay, I'm back. So this time, Scottish kings didn't have much revenue from the crown, and this reign was non-exempt. After James was captured, royal patronage stopped happening. Basically, it was a free-for-all with the money while James was held hostage in England. His coronation took place at Scone Abbey on May 14th, 1424. He performed a knighthood ceremony for 18 high-standing nobles, including Albany's son, Alexander Stuart. So not the original, not the first Albany we talked about, and not the second, but no, this is the third one in this time. Parliament was then called to talk about the issue of James' ransom, his ransom payments. What they heard was James was taking his position and authority as a monarch. He secured the passing of legislation made to improve income by taking away the patronage of royal predecessors and guardians. This affected both Earls of Douglas and Mar. So basically, any earl or person of high standing rank could not take or move money around like they had been doing in James's absence, and what had drained the crown of money. They were using, basically using the crown's money as their own personal bank. James was still dependent of the nobility for its support, especially when it came to Douglas. While he had first taken a less confrontational stance, an exception was to Walter Stewart. This was Albany's other son. Walter was the heir of the earldom of Lennox and had been in an open revolt against his father in 1423. The reason why, you ask? He is a spoiled brat. I'm just kidding. No, it was for not giving his younger brother Alexander the title. He also disagreed with his father's consent to bring James back to Scotland. So clearly Walter was on his grandfather's side. In turn, James had Walter arrested on May 13th of 1424 and imprisoned on Bass Rock. The irony. Douglas died at the Battle of Verneuil in August of 1424. This weakened the position of his son Archibald, the 5th Earl of Douglas. On October 14th, I gotta do my makeup or I'm gonna screw this all up today. On October 12th of 1424, James and Archibald met at Melrose Abbey. So apparently they were there to agree the appointment of John Fogo to the abbacy. It may have also been meant as an official acceptance of Douglas, but it also showed a change in the Black Douglas prominence. So important Douglas allies died in France, and that realigned the heirs with the rival nobles through family ties. At the same time, Douglas experienced allegiance loss in the Lothians. This all improved James' position. He continued to retain Black Douglas support, giving him, I'm just trying to bring this up a little bit, giving him campaign of political alienation of Albany and his family. Buchan's lands didn't go to the Albany Stuarts, but they were given up to the town. Albany's father-in-law, Duncan, Earl of Lennox, was imprisoned. In December, the Duke's main ally, Alexander Stuart, Earl of Mar, settled his issues with the king. A sitting of Parliament in March of 1425 brought on the arrest of Albany, Isabella, his wife, and their son Alexander. Albany's other son, the brat Walter, just kidding, was already in prison, and his youngest son, James, escaped to Lennox. Now, James, Albany's son, I wish he had Albany's son, James, led the men of Lennox and Argyll in an open rebellion against King James. Albany's and his sons Walter and Alexander, as well as Duncan, Earl of Lennox, were in Stirling Castle for their trial on May 18th. At a specially convened parliament, an assembly of 7 earls and 14 lesser nobles was appointed to hear the evidence that connected the prisoners to the rebellion in Lennox. The 4 men were sentenced on the charges, and they were immediately beheaded in front of Stirling Castle. James showed a ruthless side of himself in the destruction of his close family. Remember, this is his cousins. These are his cousins, this family. To that I say, fuck around and find out. These guys fucked around and they found out. This freed up the forfeited earldoms of Fife, Menteith, and Lennox. An inquiry set up by James into the dispersal of numerous crown estates proved to be a problem and exposed legal defects in quite a few transactions. James tried to boost his income further through taxing and succeeded in getting Parliament to pass legislation in 1424 for a tax to go towards his ransom. 26,000 pounds was raised, but he only sent 12,000 pounds. By 1429, he stopped paying the ransom completely and used the rest of the taxation income on cannons and luxury items from Flanders. After a fire in Linlithgow Castle in 1425, funds were used to rebuild. This rebuild continued until 1437 and took an estimated 1/10 of royal income. So this was a heavy duty. I would love to see how much money. So back then, 26,000 pounds was, for us now, probably millions of dollars. Like the equivalent to millions of dollars now. I mean, money was obviously of lesser value back then. In July of 1428, the king called a general council in Perth and focused on getting finances for the expedition to the Highlands against the partially independent Lord of the Isles. At first, the council was against granting James the funds, but they ended up giving in to his wishes. It looked like it wasn't going to be a straight out attack on the Gaels in the north. James had decided to use some force to solidify royal authority. So the leaders of the Gaelic families in the north and west were called upon by James to a meeting with Parliament in Inverness. I think he was just like flexing muscles at this point. Among those that came, James arrested 50 of them, including Alexander, 3rd Lord of the Isles, and his mother, Mariota, Countess of Ross. A few were executed, but the rest, except for Alexander and his mother, were quickly let go. So during Alexander's captivity, James attempted to split Clan Domhnall, which would later become Clan Donald, also known as MacDonald. Alexander's uncle, John Moore, was asked by an agent of the king to take the clan leadership, but he refused while his nephew was being held captive. So this led to the arrest and murder by the agent. James needed allies in the Highlands, so he had to soften his approach to the Lord of the Isles. Alexander was freed in hopes he'd become a royal servant of the crown. Instead, he led an attack on the castle and borough of Inverness in spring of 1429. That was probably from pressure from both his cousin Donald Balloch and Alistair Carrick. I think that's how you pronounce those two. So this whole situation got worse when they called in James, Albany's son, and told him he may be king. The king's intention was to form an alliance against the MacDonalds, which caused the English to lose trust in James's motives. So they tried to bring back Albany's son before anything significant happened. James, Albany's son, died suddenly, releasing the king to get ready for action against the lordship. So both armies arrive on June 21st at Lakbar, and Alexander was heavily defeated. He escaped to Islay, but James continued his war on the lordship by taking Dingwall and, I butcher this every time, and Urquhart Castle. He took advantage when he sent an army with artillery to the Isles. Alexander probably realized that this was hopeless and tried to negotiate terms of surrender. James demanded and got his total submission. In August of 1429, James gave royal authority to Alexander for the keeping of the peace in the Highlands, but Isles men weren't done. There was another uprising in September of 1431 and gave 2 defeats to the king's men, which set James back in credibility. In 1428, Charles VII of France sent his ambassador, Renault of Chartres. He was the Archbishop of Reims. He sent him to Scotland to get James to renew the old alliance. The term included marrying Princess Margaret to Louis, the Dauphin of France, as well as a gift of the province of Santonge to James. After the approval of the treaty in October of 1428, James now had his daughter betrothed to the French royalty and a piece of French land. His political importance in Europe went up. James took a non-aligned position in England, France, and Burgundy, but this opened up his communication with other European countries. For the most part, Anglo-Scottish relations were pretty amicable. The extension of the truce helped the English cause in France, but they didn't know about the treaty and marriage between the Scots and the French. The king now found himself balancing his European responses carefully. The Duke of Burgundy was one of England's main allies, and he also held positions in low countries. Well, that was a fucking mishap, huh? As did Scotland. This was a major trading partner for Scotland. So the Duke of Burgundy was one of England's main allies, and he also held position of the Low Countries, as did Scotland. This was a major trading partner for Scotland. It also left James's support for France muted. In May of 1436, their truce with England expired, but James's view on the Anglo-French problem changed following their realignment. I am going to pop off to do this real quick, do my mascara real quick. Talks between England and France gave way to an alliance between Burgundy and France. France then requested Scotland's involvement in the war and for the marriage between Margaret and the Dauphin to take place. So in 1436, Margaret sailed to France. Scotland then entered the war, and James led the army, led the army to lay siege at England's area of Roxburgh Castle. This campaign would be pivotal. James appointed his cousin, Robert Stewart of Athol, as the constable of the host. Robert was not experienced, but still in charge of the wardens, both Earls and Douglas. So this led to resentment, as the large army was living off land that Earls had interest in. When the troop from northern England came in to relieve the fortress, Scotland retreated quickly, and this led to James reversing terms in both foreign policy and internal authority. Now, on the back of all this, we still have the scorned Albany Stuarts. After the retreat in France, James' political standing was not looking so good. Athol used this and the negative reaction at the council meeting that killing the king was the only good choice they had. Athol had already seen both his brothers take control of the country. Many people were torn years apart, were obviously still upset about being left without jobs. Athol hosted a general council meeting on February 4th of 1437 at his home in Perth. King James and Queen Joan were nearby at Blackfriars Monastery. On February 20th, James and Joan were in their chambers and not close to their servants. The king's chamberlain, Robert Stewart, Athol's grandson, and his heir, gave Athol's men access to the monastery. The king was alerted and immediately tried to escape through a tunnel which had been blocked. So now he found himself trapped, and he was murdered there. The queen was found harmed in the attack, but she escaped. So now little James, King James II, was kept safe. Let's see if this actually worked today. Joan had tried several times to become regent for her son, but it was never allowed. Instead, Archibald, Earl of Douglas, was made to act as lieutenant general of the kingdom. So James's embalmed heart may have made it to the Holy Land. There was a payment in £90 to a knight of the Order of St. John. It was returned to the Charter House from the island of Rhodes. James was buried near Carthusian Monastery, which he had founded. His body has not been found, and same for his queen, Joan. So it's fun fact time. On this was a little hard, but I did find some stuff. Just two things. James was a good athlete, and he loved music, and he is the 16th great grandfather to the current King Charles. So those are my fun facts for today. So I'm going to pop off and do my lipstick, and then I will be back. This is the red lip combo from Vive. Modern, what did I say earlier? Modern matte lipstick and the liner, both in Muse. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed. I'll be back next week. As usual, the products I used are down below in the description. If you enjoyed this, please give it a thumbs up. Also, if you have not yet done so, please subscribe. That really helps me out. If there's something you want me to cover, leave a comment below and let me know. Give me a follow on Instagram. And that's it. Catch you next week. Thanks. Bye.